I think we should go ahead and get started. Welcome to week 2 for our Wednesday evening Bible study, or WEBS. We're doing this all online. There's no one else here with me. Um, Glad to have all of you here. Got a lot of very nice comments about last week. It seems like everything went pretty well. Still would appreciate your input as the days and weeks go forward. Any way that we can do this better, make this better. Very experimental. We're just learning a little bit at a time. We are, of course, studying the minor prophets through the lens of hope, and this week we get to begin on our first of the minor prophets, and boy, it's a doozy. Now, when I was reading the book of Hosea, especially the famous first 3 chapters, which is really where we're going to focus tonight, I was reminded of a certain kind of music. But it's also not a type of music that I listen to very often. I was sort of reminded of blues music. Hosea is a blues singer. He's talking about things that make him upset, that make him hurt, that make him sad. Or he could maybe be a country singer. It's kind of the stereotype about country music, that it's all about, you know, women and men whose husbands and wives have left them, and they feel sad, they feel blue, they're drinking their night away, strumming on a guitar. I don't much listen to country music either. So, the music that I listen to a lot of 60s and 70s rock, and 60s and 70s rock produced this great song by the Guess who says, "American woman, stay away from me. American woman, mama, let me be. Don't come hanging around my door. I don't want to see your face no more. I got more important things to do than spend my time growing old with you. I don't need your war machines. I don't need your ghetto scenes." That's the words of the prophet known as the Guess Who. That's what I want to talk about tonight, is how Hosea uses the pain that is in his life, the pain that he experiences on a day-to-day basis, and he channels that into a vision of what God is going through and what the relationship between God and Israel is like. Hosea is very hurt. Hosea is very sad. And so I want to talk about that tonight. Just a reminder that when we get around to about 8:30 or a little after, I'm going to take about a 5-minute break. Before then, and during that time especially, I really encourage you all to, any comments that you have, any questions that you have about the book of Hosea or any of the things that we talk about, add those to the comments, and that'll be the second part of the broadcast here, as I will try to address those questions or comments. And I would love it if you all could talk with each other. Of course, if you're watching with a family member or a friend, I encourage you all during the stream to talk to one another about what it is that you have experienced when you've read the book of Hosea, or questions that you might have. That will make all of this a lot more interesting than just me talking to a camera. So we need to talk first of all about where it is that Hosea lived. One of the things that is always very important when you're reading a book of the Bible, especially one that you may not be as familiar with, is it's really important to know when it's taking place and who the author or authors are and who they're talking to and where they're talking from. And in order to do that with Hosea, and indeed for all of the prophets, the minor prophets especially, it's going to be really important that we do just a quick crash course on the history of the people of Israel. Really, this is the history of the whole Old Testament, where we're just going to hit the most important bullet points. That's what I have behind me written on the whiteboard. And if you're not able to see it, don't worry, I'm going to read everything that's on there. So if you're just hearing my voice, or if the video quality isn't good enough for you, you're just going to be able to listen to me. So let's talk about the story of Israel as a whole, focusing just on the main events, the most important parts of Israel's history. Israel's history really begins with Abraham. Abraham shows up in the 12th chapter of Genesis. Everything before then we could really call prehistory. It's stuff that's lost to the mists of time. But Abraham is where we start getting a real story of a real group of people. Abraham is called by God to go to a certain land, and there in that land, he and his descendants will have that land. That's their land. This is called the Abrahamic covenant. Covenant is going to be really important. A covenant is basically a treaty that is signed between two people. And Abraham is given a covenant by God that if they move to this land, they will have children and grandchildren. The whole land will be teeming with Abraham's descendants. So that's the first covenant. Abraham has children. Eventually, those children, those descendants, end up in the land of Egypt. 400 years pass. The second most important, and probably the most important development for the people of Israel, is what happens in the book of Exodus. Moses takes the people out of Egypt and into the promised land. Before they get there, they go to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and they hear the law. And this law represents a new covenant. It works like this. God will keep these people as his people, and in return, they will follow this law. The law is enumerated throughout the book of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This law will be the binding contract between the Hebrew people, who are about to become the Israelite people, and their God. Now, when the people first get to Israel, they're loosely held together. They're sort of a collection of tribes. And the tribes you know as the names of the sons of Jacob. There's the tribe Benjamin. I like that tribe, of course. There's the Levite tribe, etc., etc. These 12 tribes of Israel. But eventually, these 12 tribes sort of band together, and they decide that it would be important for them to have a king. God kind of warns them, you probably don't want a king, but eventually, no, they have a king. And the first king isn't very good, that's Saul. But the second king is David. And he begins what's called the Davidic monarchy. With David, we sort of come out of a hard to interpret and hard to understand and hard to read history, and we get into a very definite history that archaeologists are able to uncover and understand. And David is sort of the beginning of that. David ruled in, well, let's ballpark it, 1000 BC. If you ever want to remember dates, it's really easy to remember that King David ruled in 1000 BC. It's a nice even number, and David is a really important person. And David actually kind of ruled two kingdoms that he smushed together into one. The two kingdoms were the 10 northern tribes that called themselves Israel, and that's the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes that called themselves Judah. Sometimes the 10 northern tribes, instead of Israel, were called Ephraim. So you have Israel or Ephraim in the north, and Judah to the south. David was a good king, mostly. Solomon was a okay king. That's David's son. After that, the kings weren't very good, and so in David's grandson's time, these two kingdoms that had just kind of been held together, they fell apart. And from then on, you had the 10 northern tribes, or Israel, and the 2 southern tribes, or Judah. And Jerusalem was sort of right in between, but Jerusalem was definitely belonged to Judah, to the southern tribes. All right, so this is actually the framework for a lot of the prophets. In fact, Hosea, who we're studying today, he preached initially to those northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes that were Israel. On the whole, those 10 northern tribes, even though we think 10, there's a lot of them, they're bigger, well, they were weaker. And eventually, the northern tribes would get wiped out by the Assyrians. The Assyrians sort of loomed over them for a long time, and Egypt, which was powerful at the time, they were coming up from the south, and the northern tribes kind of got stuck in the middle, and eventually Assyria said enough and swept over them, and the 10 northern tribes were absolutely demolished. It's very important to know, though, that they were taken away to another place. Some other people were brought in to live there, and they sort of continued to exist. They sort of followed the religion of the Israelites. They worshiped God. They had places where they worshiped God. They still held to some version of the law, but the southern tribes didn't like them very much after that. And in fact, way later on, what they would call those northern people that were descended from this mixed group of Assyrians, eventually they would become known as the Samaritans. And so when we read in the Gospels that the Samaritans and the Israelites or the Jews don't have anything in common, well, that's where that comes from, which is why the story of the Good Samaritan was so important to tell. All right, so after that, you just have Judah hanging out. And here's the thing, is that uh, uh, the kings in Judah and the people of Judah, they really believed that they were the true heir to this promise that David would sit on the throne forever. And when the Assyrians came and they wiped out the northern tribes, but they weren't able to wipe out the southern tribes, you could really understand how they would really believe that they were kind of invincible. This caused them to act a little bit rashly, and a lot of the kings of Judah were not very good. There's one very important king, and that's the fifth on my list of important events, and that was King Josiah. And Josiah, if you were in Sunday school as a kid, you probably learned about the boy king. He became a king when he was only 8 years old. But why Josiah is most important is that he performed a lot of reforms, a lot of religious reforms. And he did it under the guise of going back to the way things were supposed to be. Probably what was really happening is Josiah was busy cleaning up the law and cleaning up some of the things to make it a little bit more palatable to him. Most important thing for Josiah, he said that worship of God is only going to happen in one place, and that's the temple. No one will worship God by sacrifice outside of the temple. The temple is the only place where that happens. Knock down all the other structures, knock down the other temples, knock down everywhere else, only in the temple in Jerusalem. And that was Josiah's big thing. Josiah was good times. Some of the kings were good. Some of the kings were bad. By this time, even though the Assyrian Empire had started to fall apart, there was a new empire in town, and that was the Babylonians. And the Babylonians were very powerful, very scary, and eventually Babylon would come, wipe out the southern tribes, wipe out Judah, take those people, and put them into exile in Babylon. That's the last thing on my list here, the Babylonian exile. During the Babylonian exile, the people that were there, they wanted to be sure that they retained their traditions and their laws. And that's when they started to put together what we have now as the Old Testament. They put together the writings of the Torah, they put together the histories of the kings, and they started to put together the stories of the prophets. Even though they weren't done yet, they decided we don't want to lose these. These prophets were important. So they started to put the stories of the prophets together. So it's important when we read Hosea, and really any of the prophets, but tonight, Hosea, that Hosea was written initially to those northern kingdoms, with Assyria almost at the gates, a major threat. But then after Hosea preached and his disciples or people close to him wrote down his story and what they had to say, they carried it south into Judah. And there in Judah, they probably put together some different pieces of paper, some different scrolls, and made the story work well together. And then after that, well, then they spent time in exile. And so while they were in exile, they needed to make sure that they remembered the story of Hosea. And so they probably wrote a little bit more on the scroll and arranged it a little bit more. And so when you read Hosea, remember that you're kind of looking through three historical lenses. There's whatever Hosea said, and then there's whatever the people wrote about Hosea, and then there's what happened in Judah, and then there's what happened after Judah in Babylon. And so it's also important to remember that the northern tribes were not doing very well in Hosea's time. In Hosea's time, uh, for instance, there was a period of 6 kings, and 5 of those kings were assassinated. During Hosea's time, people were mixing the worship of God with the traditions and the gods of other places and other times. Now, I mentioned a little bit before the live cast began, back when we were still waiting for people to arrive. I, I mentioned that Hosea is not a story for children. We need to have a sort of frank talk about some stuff that's not for children. And so if you have little ears that are listening in, you might want to put down the phone or the screen for just a couple of minutes while we talk about this. But it's important for understanding Hosea, and so I am going to talk about it. The worship of God was being contested by the worship of Baal, or Baal sometimes, or just Baal. And the thing about Baal is that Baal and some of the deities that surrounded him that were part of his story, Baal was a fertility god. Now, fertility, of course, means he's the one you worship when you want your crops to do well, but fertility also means the sort of fertility that happens between men and women. And so sex was probably a part of the worship of Baal. You hear sometimes about temple prostitutes. Well, there were probably, perhaps, temple prostitutes as a part of the worship of Baal. And so it's absolutely no wonder that when Hosea is going to describe what the relationship is between Israel and God at the present time, and he wants to put Israel in a negative light, well, he's going to talk about prostitution. He's going to talk about, maybe your translation has whoredom. That's part of the reason why Hosea is such a shocking book, because it just talks about these really kind of shocking topics. Listen to, how the book of Hosea begins in verse 2 of the first chapter. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take for yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom. For the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord." So he went and took Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. That is a very difficult beginning to any book. But let's talk about what Hosea's image is. What is Hosea attempting to get across, especially in these first chapters? We're going to take another detour here. We need to talk about what marriage was like in this time, in Hosea's time, because we have some very nice visions and understandings of marriage in our present day. We really believe that two people, they meet each other, they fall in love, they decide that they want to live a life together and have a family together, and so they get married, and it's a wonderful, beautiful ceremony, and they live happily forever. And so when we think about infidelity, when we think about adultery and cheating, that's normally the framework in which we imagine adultery and cheating, and it's heartbreaking. Well, it was heartbreaking in the time of Hosea, but it had a very different sort of quality. This was a patriarchal society. Men were humans, and women were subservient to the men. And so having a wife was not really a matter of falling in love. Generally, your father told you who you were going to marry. Maybe a man liked a particular woman, but either way, it was probably the fathers who were going to tell them that they had to wed. And then the father would say to his daughter, "All right, you are going to marry so-and-so, and so that means that you are basically his property. You are now going to live in his house and his family's house. You will bear him children, and he is the only one that you will ever be married to. The man could take another wife. Maybe when this wife was forced to move into the household, maybe she would be wife number 2 or 3. Not only that, but it was very, very important for children to be born, because if you had children, you had more hands to work the farm, to milk cows, to do everything that was necessary to be done in order for the household to survive. And so wives and children, well, they weren't just family and people to be loved, they were economic goods. It's under this sort of idea of marriage that we have to think about what the relationship between Hosea and Gomer was like. Yes, there could have been love, and there was love in marriages. That was not the primary thing that was happening. And so, if a woman, especially, was to carry on an affair with another man, in those times it was not just that they had broken a covenant of love, it was risking the man's honor. If this woman had children that were not his, then that was a loss of financial gain. If the child came out and was very clearly didn't belong to the husband, well, that child belonged to the other man. And that's a loss of financial gain. It's a loss of honor. And so all of the guilt of infidelity, it was always put on the woman. If a man carried on an affair or had another wife or a concubine or something, that wasn't seen as such a big deal. It was frowned upon. It wasn't something you should do, but it was usually just kind of expected almost, and not something to worry about. Oh, but for a woman, especially to get pregnant by another man, this is horrible. This should not happen. So it's important also, I almost want to take off my glasses and stare deeply into the camera when I say this. It's very, very important to remember that this is a metaphor in the book of Hosea about God and Israel. But the metaphor is based off of this ancient understanding of marriage. But we should not then take the metaphor and work it back and say, this is how marriage should be. I think that we have come a long way in the time since Hosea was written, and even though Hosea uses this image of marriage, this should not be a good image of marriage. Either if Hosea and Gomer had stayed absolutely true to one another, or if it was as it is, we definitely don't want to take these images of marriage, this understanding of marriage, and say this is how things should be, because they shouldn't. And so listen to how this marriage goes, because God tells Hosea to take a wife, and he knows that this wife is not going to be true to him. And the Lord said to him, this is verse 4 in chapter 1, name him Jezreel, for in a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. On that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Child number 1 is named Jezreel. Jezreel was the location of a place where a particular king, Jehu, tricked a whole bunch of worshippers of Baal and massacred them in very bloody fashion. This is already a difficult thing to understand, because in the book of Kings, where this story is related, it's seen as a good thing. He takes out a bunch of priests of Baal and a bunch of Baal worshippers and makes sure that the people who worship the Lord survive. But even in the book of Kings, Jehu was not necessarily seen as the greatest king. And what we have here in Hosea is a threat that This sort of massacre is not how God wants to do business. And so God responds to this massacre by saying, actually, this is a bad thing, and soon I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, for what happened at that time and at that place. All right, now we have a second child. The second child, verse 6, she conceived again and bore a daughter. Then the Lord said to him, name her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer have pity on the house of Israel or forgive them. Lo Ruhamah, Lo in Hebrew always just means no or not. It means whatever it is that I say right after lo, it means don't do that. So Lo Ruhamah, no pity. I want you to have a child and say that that child is not pitied. And then in verse 8, we have a very similar thing. When she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. Then the Lord said, name him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Lo Ami, meaning very literally, not my people. The question that gets asked a lot about Hosea is, how exactly did this all go down? Did God really decide, you know what, I need Hosea to relate a prophecy, and so I am just going to have him marry someone and then have a bunch of children, and I'm going to say what he's to name them, and that will be the prophecy to the people? Probably not exactly. It is very clear, I think, that Hosea had married someone who ended up being not particularly loyal to him. Perhaps Gomer had children that did not actually belong to Hosea. But I think what's really happened here is Hosea is reflecting on the infidelity of his wife. And then he's looking out on the people of Israel, and he's seeing how they have no fidelity to their God. And instead of having fidelity to their God, they're running around with these cultists and these temple prostitutes and these worshippers of Baal, and they're committing terrible, unspeakable things. And he's saying, God must feel the way that I feel. And that's not a very hopeful text. We've gathered together to read the book of Hosea through the lens of hope. And so far, there's not a lot of hope. But this is what has happened. All right. Well, there's good news. First of all, in verse 5 and in verse 7, we see already a little bit of the glimmer of hope. On verse 5, when talking about Jezreel, God says, on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Breaking the bow is a positive thing. That means the end of war. In verse 7 it says, but I will have pity on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen. Again, this image of war coming to an end and God rescuing the people. And then in verse 10, after we had the child Lo Ami, yet the number of the people of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which can be neither measured nor numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall take possession of the land. For great shall be the day of Jezreel. So, in chapter 2, say to your brother Ami, and to your sister Ruhamah. Not Lo Ami, not Lo Ruhamah, but Ami and Ruhamah. Already, this is going to be reversed. And we go from a time where God is angry with Israel to a time where God is pleading with Israel. Verse 2, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. plead that she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. There's pleading because what has to happen if they do not come back and be true to Israel again, if Gomer does not come back and be true to Hosea again. Now, according to the law, Hosea has the right to stone Gomer or have her stoned. There's one other thing that they could do. This didn't happen very often, but it did happen, and it's described in the next verse. Or, I will strip her naked and expose her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and turn her into a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Upon her children also I will have no pity, because they are children of whoredom. And it goes on like that for a while. This is where it's important to read Hosea not as, oh yes, this is how things should be, but only as a metaphor that describes how God and Israel are getting along right now. And so God is saying through this experience that Hosea has had with Gomer, having this experience that says, I will have to do something to Israel. Israel will be treated harshly because of the way that she is treating me. And so Hosea's image here is that there is no guiding principle for the land of Israel anymore. They're just chasing after all these other gods, just like a woman who doesn't have any fidelity to her husband. And because of this, the land is falling a little bit into ruin. That's the story of Hosea. It's the story of a God who, in a sense, has been shamed by his own people. The people that he chose as his people have absolutely rejected God. And so he says, no, you won't be my people. No, I won't have any pity upon you. Bad things are going to happen. But always, 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 there's a little bit of a turn. Skip on to verse 21 in chapter 2. On that day I will answer, says the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth, and the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel, and I will sow him for myself in the land. And I will have pity on Lo Ruhamah, and I will say to Lo Ami, you are my people, and he shall say, you are my God. And chapter 3 sort of sums up what's happened. The Lord said to me again, go love a woman who has a lover and is an adulteress, just as the Lord loves the people of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes. All right, that bit there about raisin cakes, that's a little bit of something that's been lost to history. Best explanation for it is the raisin cakes were seen as something sweet that people outside of Israel really loved, and so Hosea is writing that, well, how could it be that people love those raisin cakes and not me? So, though they turn to other gods and their raisin cakes. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer of barley and a measure of wine. And I said to her, you must remain as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore. You shall not have intercourse with a man, nor I with you. The Israelites shall remain many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or teraphim. And afterwards the Israelites shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they shall come in awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the later days. Here is the image of God. If you're going to be like this, if you're going to walk away from God, Israel, then fine. I will bring you back in good times. There will be hard times, but there will always be good times again. I will bring you back. We're going to see this in the prophets often because they know that something terrible is going to happen, whether it's Assyria, whether it's Babylon. Then there's exile. which is like being back in Egypt again. And once again, God will bring them up out and will return them to the land. It's 8:38. I didn't go as far over time as I did last time. I want to talk about just one other thing. It's important, probably the passage from Hosea that Christians read the most often, because it has to do with the Christmas story of all things, is over in chapter 11. Chapter 11 begins with, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." Now we hear that phrase, "out of Egypt I called my son," after uh, Joseph has taken Mary and Jesus to Egypt because Herod is trying to kill them and they're hiding in Egypt. But then they come back from Egypt, and Matthew says, "This was to fulfill the prophecy, out of Egypt I called my son." This is important for understanding how prophecy works and how people understand prophecy. If we were to say that this phrase, "out of Egypt I called my son," if we were to say that that was about nothing more than Jesus, then really what we're saying here is God is talking about compassion to Israel, and how even though Israel has cheated on him and worshipped other gods, and he has this whole story that he's giving, and then in the middle of this prophecy he sort of turns his head and says, "and out of Egypt I called my son." That's about Jesus. You'll find out about that later. No, I don't think that's what's happening here. Um, what happens is that Matthew understands that people need to connect what's happening in the life of Jesus and Jesus himself to these prophecies. These prophecies tell how God works. These prophecies tell how God treats his people, whether that's Israel or the whole world. And so it's important that Matthew make that connection explicit. And so Matthew uses the prophecies to say, remember how God acted in those times? Remember when Israel had gone far away from God? Do you remember when Israel was playing the whore to God? And then remember what God said? That when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. That's happening again. That's going to happen in my son Jesus that I have sent to you. And that's how Jesus is fulfilled. Or rather, that's how the prophecies are fulfilled in Jesus. All right. The rest of Hosea, I invite you to read through all of these lenses. The story of the unchaste wife sort of colors how the rest of the book of Hosea works. It's like this back and forth, that at first God is angry and sad and upset by how he's being treated and how the people are not worshiping him. And then he says, "But I will have pity. I will have remembrance." It's a story about how God grieves and is hurt and is in pain and is angry when people treat him poorly or do not worship him or confuse their worship of him with the worship of other things and other beings. But it's a story about how God is always still reaching out and looking to forgive what should be unforgivable. All right, I'm going to take about a 5-minute break. I'm going to get a drink of water and stretch my legs. Encourage you all to come back with any questions or comments. Use the comment section, and I'll be back in just a little bit, hopefully, to take some questions. right, that's a lot of dead air. So glad to see everybody that's joined us. Hi, Susan. Didn't get to say hi to you earlier. Wayne and Sean, say hi to all. Hello, Wayne. Hello, Sean. Good to have the Walters with us here today. I see lots of people that have also tuned in. Just glad to have everybody here with us. Well, even if you all don't have questions now, I hope if you have things that come to mind or anything that you want to share, hope that you will send me an email or make a comment on this video. I check them throughout the week, so I'll get back to you if you have anything to say. Well, what else shall I add? Mostly that this was a really hard one to start on. The Minor Prophets seem like a nice easy chunk of the Bible to read. You get to read a lot, but they're not very long. Hosea probably turns a lot of people off because of its very difficult nature. It's talking about infidelity and sex and all these things that we really don't want to talk about. But it ends up being a really powerful image. It's one with a lot of pathos and a lot of feeling. And so actually some of the best poetry and artwork has been done about Hosea and his fear of losing Gomer, his fear of being so shamed by what it is that Gomer is doing, and how that relates also to this feeling that God has for Israel. We won't always, of course, be able to read much of the book. There's still several more chapters of Hosea that we didn't get to cover, but all of those chapters can be understood in this framework and this context. So I encourage you all to keep reading, read more, read Hosea again. Next week, we will be reading the books of Joel and Obadiah, two of the shortest, and hoping to do just about all of Joel and Obadiah. So hope you can join us for then. Again, be sure to share this. Also, if you're just tuning in and wanted to see this from the beginning, after I stop going live, it's going to disappear for a little bit, but it'll be posted a little bit later. And we'll also have this posted to YouTube tomorrow, so if you don't like watching on Facebook Live or you want to share it with somebody else, you can check it out on YouTube. Good to see all of you all, and may the grace and peace of God be always with you.